In this video, I'm going to review a bike by the brand Otso, the Waheela S, a multi-wheel size gravel bike. Will it have you screaming Waheela or Wa later? Find out in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you love gravel bikes, bike touring, the supple life, then smash that subscribe button. You have found your people. So you might not be familiar with the brand Otso, but it's actually the bike brand company of Wolf Tooth components. They offer a couple different bikes, a fat bike, which I'm also going to review this winter, the Warrican, a stainless steel multi-wheel size gravel bike, and the Waheela S, in which talking to them sounds really similar to the Warrican, but it is suspension corrected. The frame is steel and the fork is carbon. It's their house brand lithic. The bike is a multi-wheel size bike. I had them send it over with a 27.5 wheel set and tires. I believe it's running the Thunderbolts in 2.1. The bike has through axles, front and rear, as well as disc brakes. This version shipped with BB7s. So utilitarian, nothing too blingy, pretty functional. The drifters were Apex and the drivetrain was all Apex. The handlebar was a lithic handlebar and the saddle was a WTB saddle rebranded with the Otso branding. In terms of sizing, I rode the size medium, and once again, I'm 5'8", 29-inch inseam. I typically ride size 52 to 53 centimeter frames and love long walks on the beach. And the size medium for me was a perfect fit. Other nice touches is that the carbon fork does have hidden eyelets, so you can put fenders and make this into a year-round commuting bike. And the rear end has some raise-ons to put racks and fenders. This bike also has some interesting tricks up its sleeve. It's actually suspension corrected. So although the bike I rode had the rigid lithic fork, you can also use a low fork or a short travel road suspension fork. If you look at the head tube, it's actually a really small head tube and a big spacer. So when you run that suspension fork, you swap out that spacer. And conversely, to run a rigid fork, you have to use that spacer to compensate for that travel. Another interesting trick up its sleeve is actually a tuning chip in the rear of the bike. It kind of works like a sliding dropout, but it actually has two fixed positions. One nice touch is on the brake side, it's actually connected to the whole contraption. So when you flip the chip, as it were, to adjust the chainstay length, you don't have to monkey around with removing the brake caliper since it's all connected into that component. I didn't get a chance to mess around with it too much because the bike did come in late in the season and I had to return it fairly quickly. But I'm hoping in the spring to get a shot at the Warrican, which also incorporates the same adjustable chainstay geometry. On our scales, it weighed in at around 23.5 pounds. I think one cool thing is that it comes in at under $2,000. So I think, in my opinion, a pretty good value, especially when you're comparing it to another bike that would ride similarly, like the Surly Midnight Special, which has the not very attractive fork, it's not carbon, and has kind of fake through axles. So that's all well and good, but how does this bike ride? You guys know I have feelings about multi-wheel size bikes. I feel like they typically don't ride well in their 27.5 or 650B version. Solely basing the ride on the 650B, I have to say it was surprisingly fun. I had an absolute blast with this bike. It just has so much get up and go. The rear end was quick and responsive, but just accelerated well. It handled standing climbs really well. And the front end of the bike was definitely a little bit more on the lively side in terms of handling. So not super stable and dull, but a pretty good balance with the rear end. Going down a rough descent, it held its line. You definitely had to stay on top of it a little bit. But this bike with the Thunderbird tires just really made it a gravel eating machine and just a blast to ride. It really felt like if a road bike had a baby with a monster truck. In some ways, really reminiscent for me as to how the Surly Midnight Special, but in some ways better than the Midnight Special because it comes with Thunderbirds. It has that carbon fork. It has actual through axles, not faux axles. Overall, I felt like the front matched the rear pretty well. There wasn't any like weird handling things. If you generally like your bikes slightly on the more responsive side, then this bike is definitely for you. Of the bikes I've ridden this year, I feel like it feels quicker and more nimble than version 4 Warbird, then the Kona Robe NRB DL, then the Gorilla Monsoon, then the Specialized Sequoia. Probably not as jumpy as like the Specialized Verge, but definitely in that direction. The bike that it rides most closely to, in my opinion, is a bike like the Surly Midnight Special. So in that spectrum between stable and touring-like to more racy, it's definitely past that middle of the road handling and is biased more towards that racy feelingness. Racy feeling bikeness. So a lot to like in this bike, but I did have a couple of concerns, a couple of things that I wasn't super hot on. So probably the most noticeable thing was actually the chainstays. They're bowed out in such a way that if you have really long feet, really wide feet, you're gonna find yourself hitting them on occasion. I'm solidly a size 9. My feet aren't overly large, but I did find myself hitting the chainstays a couple times during a ride. So if you have your cleats positioned so your feet are really pushed backwards, or you have really big feet, it's going to be an issue. Another downside, which for me is just my own personal thing, is I wish that the fork had lowrider mounts or mounts for anything cages. I like my bikes racy and useful, and this definitely just kind of takes some of that utility away. If I were to purchase a bike like this, I would probably end up getting another fork with rack mounts, so I can kind of create my dream hybrid fun riding but also useful bike. But all that said, for under $2,000, this Apex 1 build is pretty good value when you compare it to a bike like the Midnight Special. And finally, the last thing that I wasn't too hot on this bike, but kind of par for course now in the adventure / gravel bike market, is the gearing. I feel like it's geared too high for my ability, my terrain, and for the way I would use the bike. I think if you were a super strong rider or didn't live in a place with mountains, with extended double-digit climbs, then the gearing would be fine. But again, if I were to purchase this bike and ride around here and take it on the trips that I would take, I'd probably be swapping out the chainring. So overall, this bike was an absolute blast to ride. It ticks a lot of boxes, not all the boxes for me, but I think if you're looking for a general quick feeling event bike that you can run on gravel roads and paved roads, if you want to do 700C, if that's still a thing, you can do it with this bike. I love that it does have eyelets for fenders and a rear rack, so you can turn it into a year-round riding bike or even a commuting bike and take the racks off and ride hard on the weekend. So Otso, a new brand to me, but the Waheela has got me excited about their other bikes. So I'm actually going to be reviewing one of their fat bikes, look for that soon, and hopefully get a crack at the Workin when the snow melts. If you have any other questions, leave those in the comments below. And if you like reviews like this, consider supporting the channel via our PayPal or Patreon. It's what keeps this site going and independent. And as always, keep the supple side down.